Remove her. Right now. She has no business being in this VIP box. The words struck the luxury suite harder than the roar echoing through the stadium outside. Conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze in midair. Executives, sponsors, former athletes, and invited guests all turned toward the woman standing quietly beside the panoramic glass overlooking the field. Naomi Brooks didn't move. She wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal jacket with no designer logo, no expensive jewelry, and no visible sign of wealth. She looked more like someone who had wandered into the wrong hospitality area than a guest expected to sit among billion-dollar sponsors. At least, that was what Ethan Collins believed. The stadium's operations manager stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking across the marble floor. His jaw tightened as he pointed toward the suite entrance. VIP guests pay to be here. You don't belong. The sentence landed like a public verdict. A few people exchanged uneasy looks. Others quietly nodded, convinced they had just witnessed security doing its job. One man in an expensive tailored suit smirked before muttering, "I knew something looked off." A woman standing near the buffet folded her arms and whispered to her companion, "They really need better access control." Naomi heard every word. She answered none of them. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Brooks. Outside, nearly 70,000 fans filled the stadium with anticipation. Television crews counted down the final minutes before kickoff. Across the country, millions waited for the opening whistle of the biggest game of the season. Yet inside Suite 401, another contest had quietly begun. It wasn't about football. It was about appearances. Ethan folded his arms. "Let's make this easy," he said. "Show me who invited you, or security will escort you out." Naomi slowly folded the game program she had been reading. Her movements were calm, almost deliberate. "My credentials are valid," she replied softly. No anger, no pleading, no attempt to impress anyone in the room. That calm seemed to irritate Ethan even more. "We've seen fake credentials before," he answered. "You're not fooling anyone today." Laughter drifted from one side of the suite. Not loud enough to seem cruel, just enough to encourage everyone else to stay silent. Near the entrance, a young hospitality coordinator named Emily Carter glanced toward the digital guest registry on her tablet. The name Naomi Brooks looked strangely familiar. She hesitated, taking one cautious step forward before Ethan caught her eye with a sharp stare that warned her not to interfere. The moment slipped away. Two uniformed security officers entered the suite. Their expressions remained professional as they approached Naomi. One offered a respectful nod before speaking. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." Naomi lifted her eyes toward the brightly lit field below, where players continued warming up beneath thousands of flashing cameras. A faint smile crossed her face. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition. She had lived through moments like this before. Different places, different people, the same assumptions. Quietly, she slipped one hand into her jacket pocket, her fingertips resting lightly against her phone. Around her, the entire suite seemed to hold its breath, unaware that within moments it would not just be one woman leaving the VIP box. The biggest game of the year itself would be forced to wait. 10 minutes earlier, before anyone questioned her presence, Naomi Brooks had walked toward the stadium like thousands of other fans arriving for the biggest game of the season. The sidewalks were alive with music, street vendors, television crews, and jerseys in every direction. Excitement filled the afternoon air, but Naomi noticed something different. She watched people instead of the spectacle. She watched security officers greeting some guests with warm smiles while studying others with quiet suspicion. She had seen those invisible lines before. They rarely appeared in rulebooks, yet everyone seemed to know exactly where they were. Naomi adjusted the strap of the small leather bag resting on her shoulder and continued toward the VIP entrance without changing her pace. She carried no luxury handbag, wore no designer sunglasses, and displayed nothing that suggested she controlled a company worth billions of dollars. That was intentional. She had spent years discovering that expensive clothing often earned respect long before character ever had the chance. Today, she wanted honesty instead of courtesy purchased by appearances. Her ticket had been issued under her real name. No aliases. No private security. No executive escort. Even the stadium president had no idea she would be attending in person. The board believed she was traveling overseas for investor meetings. Only one person knew the truth: her executive assistant, Rachel Morgan. Earlier that morning, Rachel had asked if she wanted stadium management informed about her arrival. Naomi answered with the same quiet certainty she always carried. No. If they prepare for me, they'll prepare their manners too. Rachel had smiled, understanding exactly what that meant. For months, anonymous complaints had reached corporate headquarters. Some described subtle discrimination toward guests who didn't fit the image of luxury clients. Others spoke about unnecessary identification checks, dismissive attitudes, and selective enforcement of policies. None of the reports contained enough evidence for disciplinary action. Naomi never liked making decisions based only on paperwork. She believed cultures revealed themselves when leaders weren't expected. As she approached the VIP entrance, the scanner flashed green the instant her digital credential appeared. The attendant barely glanced at her before opening the gate. Another employee, however, lifted an eyebrow after watching her walk through. His eyes lingered on her jeans a second longer than necessary before he quietly picked up a radio. Naomi noticed. She simply kept walking. The private elevator carried her towards Suite 401 in complete silence. Soft instrumental music played overhead while polished steel walls reflected her calm expression. She remembered another elevator nearly 20 years earlier, inside an office tower where a receptionist had mistaken her for the cleaning staff before she even spoke. She remembered smiling then too. Not because it hadn't hurt, but because anger had never built companies. Discipline had. When the elevator doors opened, an attendant welcomed arriving executives with practiced enthusiasm. "Enjoy the game, everyone." The greeting reached every guest except Naomi. She received only a quick glance before the attendant returned to smiling at the couple behind her. Naomi stepped into the luxurious suite, overlooking the brilliant green field where players stretched beneath towering stadium lights. She quietly took her place beside the glass, unaware that across the room, Ethan Collins had already noticed the woman who, in his mind, looked completely out of place. Naomi had barely spent 2 minutes inside the suite before the invisible examination began. It didn't start with security. It started with glances, the kind that lingered just a second too long before sliding away as though nothing had happened. Every polished conversation around her continued, but the rhythm felt different whenever someone noticed the woman in jeans standing quietly beside the glass. Ethan Collins watched from across the room without introducing himself. 20 years of managing premium events had convinced him he could identify every type of guest within seconds. Sponsors carried themselves one way, owners another. Celebrities expected attention before they asked for it. Naomi fit none of those categories in his mind. Instead of approaching with courtesy, he walked toward the hospitality desk near the entrance. "Who checked her in?" he asked. The concierge looked down at the tablet. Her credentials scanned successfully. Ethan frowned. "Scan it again." Emily Carter accepted Naomi's digital pass with an apologetic smile. The scanner flashed green immediately. A soft confirmation tone echoed across the desk. Everything was valid. Emily looked up. "It's confirmed." Ethan's expression hardened instead of relaxing. "Run another verification." Naomi extended her phone without protest. She had expected exactly this. Emily scanned the credential again. Green. Perfect match. Ethan leaned closer to the screen before quietly shaking his head. Technology isn't always right. Naomi finally looked at him. Neither are assumptions. The sentence wasn't loud, but it landed with surprising weight. Ethan ignored it. Instead, he folded his arms and spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Ma'am, premium access requires more than a barcode." Conversations nearby slowed. A middle-aged businessman wearing a championship ring glanced toward Naomi before smiling to the executive standing beside him. Probably borrowed somebody's pass. His companion laughed softly. Or bought it online. Another guest joined in. These games attract all kinds of people. Naomi remained perfectly still. She had learned years earlier that prejudice often became louder when it wasn't challenged. Across the suite, Emily quietly searched the executive guest registry again. The name Naomi Brooks remained highlighted with unrestricted VIP authorization. Beside the name sat a classification she had never seen assigned to an ordinary guest. Executive level. Confidential. She looked toward Ethan. Sir. Before she could continue, he interrupted her. Focus on your job. Emily lowered her eyes, but uncertainty stayed on her face. Two security supervisors entered the suite after receiving Ethan's radio call. What's the situation? One asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. Possible credential misuse. We need verification before kickoff. Naomi smiled faintly. You've already verified it twice. Ethan looked directly at her. We're verifying you. Those words settled over the suite like cold air. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others seemed entertained by the confrontation. One woman quietly raised her phone beneath the table, pretending to read messages while recording the exchange. Another guest whispered, She hasn't argued once. His wife answered softly, She hasn't needed to. Outside the enormous windows, fireworks erupted above the stadium as player introductions prepared to begin. Music thundered through the speakers while thousands of fans rose to their feet. Inside Suite 401, however, every eye remained fixed on Naomi Brooks. The game had not yet started, but another contest had already found its opening whistle, and with every passing second, Ethan Collins became more determined to prove that the calm woman standing before him could not possibly belong where she already was. Emily Carter saw the truth before anyone else was willing to say it out loud. Her tablet was still open behind the hospitality desk, the stadium's executive registry glowing beneath her fingertips. Naomi Brooks. Suite 401. Executive level. Confidential access. Owner group clearance. The words stared back at her with the cold certainty of evidence. But across the room, Ethan Collins had already decided what kind of story he wanted this to be. He stood in front of Naomi like a gatekeeper guarding a kingdom, his shoulders squared, his voice calm enough to sound official and sharp enough to cut. Until we confirm who you really are, he said, you need to step away from the glass and come with security. Naomi turned from the field slowly. You have confirmed who I am, she said. You just don't like what the answer says. A few guests heard it. A few looked down. A few pretended not to understand. Emily swallowed hard and stepped from behind the desk. Mr. Collins, she said, her voice small at first. Her credential is valid. Ethan didn't turn around. Emily, this is not your concern. But it was. It had become her concern the moment she watched the scanner flash green 3 times and still saw Naomi treated like a threat. Emily tightened her grip around the tablet. It says executive clearance, she continued, louder now. The suite shifted. Someone near the buffet stopped pouring champagne. A former player sitting by the leather chairs leaned forward. The woman secretly recording raised her phone a little higher. Ethan finally turned, his expression warning her to disappear back into obedience. You're reading the system incorrectly, he said. Emily shook her head. No, sir. I'm not. Those 4 words changed the temperature in the room. For the first time, Ethan's confidence cracked, not enough for everyone to see, but enough for Naomi to notice. Security paused beside her, waiting for direction that no longer felt simple. A guest in a gray suit asked quietly, if her pass is valid, why are we doing this? Another answered under his breath, because she doesn't look like the rest of us. The sentence wasn't meant to travel, but it did. It moved through the suite like smoke. Naomi heard it. Emily heard it. Ethan heard it too, and that was why his face tightened. We don't make decisions based on looks, he snapped. Naomi's eyes stayed on him. Then stop proving otherwise. Silence dropped hard. Outside, the stadium announcer began building toward the national broadcast intro, his voice booming over the crowd. But inside Suite 401, the only sound was the soft hum of screens and the nervous breath of people realizing this was no longer a misunderstanding. Emily took one more step forward and lifted the tablet slightly. Her name isn't just on the guest list, she said. It's protected. I've only seen that clearance once before, during ownership review. Ethan moved fast, snatching the tablet from her hand before she could show anyone else. Enough, he said. Emily flinched, but she didn't step back. You can take the tablet, she said, her voice trembling now but clear. But you can't change what I saw. The former player stood up slowly. I saw it too, he said. The woman recording whispered, this is getting bad. Naomi remained still, her face composed, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply allowed the room to reveal itself. Ethan looked around and realized witnesses were no longer passive. They were awake, and that made him dangerous. The tension inside Suite 401 had become impossible to disguise. Every conversation had faded into whispers, every pair of eyes fixed on the silent woman standing between two security officers. Ethan Collins knew he was losing control of the room, and that frightened him more than the possibility that he might be wrong. Leaders who built their authority on certainty rarely knew what to do when doubt appeared in public. He straightened his jacket and forced confidence back into his voice. "This discussion is over," he declared. "Escort her out." Neither officer moved immediately. One of them looked at Naomi, then at Emily, then back toward Ethan, sensing that something about the situation no longer matched the routine removal they had expected. Ethan's patience snapped. "Did you hear me?" he barked. "Remove her from the suite." The senior officer finally stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'd appreciate your cooperation." Naomi met his eyes with calm respect. "I don't blame you for doing your job." Then she looked past him toward Ethan. "I only hope he understands what his job actually is." Ethan laughed once, short and dismissive. "You're in no position to lecture anyone." Frustrated that no one seemed willing to act quickly enough, he strode toward Naomi and reached for the sleeve of her jacket, intending to steer her toward the exit before security could respond. His fingertips barely brushed the fabric. "Sir," one of the security officers said immediately, stepping between them, "please allow us to handle this." Several guests gasped. Emily instinctively stepped forward. "Mr. Collins, please don't." Ethan withdrew his hand, irritation spreading across his face. Naomi slowly glanced at the sleeve he had reached for before lifting her eyes again. There was no anger in them, only disappointment. For a brief moment, another memory crossed her mind. She remembered standing outside a corporate boardroom 23 years earlier as a young intern, wearing the only business suit she could afford. A senior executive had mistaken her for catering staff and asked her to clear coffee cups before an important meeting. She had smiled then, picked up the cups without argument, and later returned to the same room as the youngest executive ever promoted by the company. That day had taught her something she never forgot. Titles could be delayed. Character could not. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. Naomi smoothed the sleeve of her jacket and looked calmly at Ethan. "Please don't do that again," she said. Her voice remained steady enough to make the room even quieter. Outside, the stadium announcer began introducing the starting lineups. The crowd erupted with cheers that shook the glass walls around the suite. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt frozen. One guest quietly whispered, "This has gone too far." Another answered, "Someone should stop this." The woman recording hadn't lowered her phone once. Every word, every gesture, every expression had been captured. Ethan, convinced that hesitation made him look weak, doubled down. "If you refuse to leave voluntarily," he announced loudly enough for the entire suite to hear, "security will escort you from the premises." Naomi gave a slight nod, as though she had finally reached the answer she came looking for. She slipped her phone from her jacket pocket, unlocked the screen with one calm motion, and glanced at the display for only a second. Then she pressed a single contact. The call connected almost instantly. She raised the phone to her ear and spoke only 6 quiet words. "Rachel, begin Protocol 11. Right now." She ended the call before anyone could ask another question. No explanation followed. No threat. No dramatic speech. Only silence. Around the suite, confused faces exchanged uncertain looks. Ethan folded his arms with a satisfied smile, believing the mysterious phone call had been nothing more than a desperate bluff. None of them realized that, at that exact moment, alarms were beginning to ripple through offices far beyond the walls of the stadium. Rachel Morgan was halfway through reviewing quarterly reports when Naomi's call appeared on her screen. Naomi almost never interrupted meetings with phone calls. When she did, every second mattered. Rachel answered immediately. "Rachel, begin Protocol 11. Right now." The line disconnected before she could respond. She didn't need further instructions. Her expression changed instantly. Within seconds, she was moving through the Executive Operations Center with calm urgency, opening a secure authentication panel that very few employees even knew existed. 1 authorization code, 2 biometric confirmations, a final encrypted approval. Protocol 11 was activated. It had never been designed for ordinary emergencies. It existed for one purpose only: Whenever the chief executive officer personally reported an executive security incident while visiting a company-owned property, every operation involving executive authority was immediately frozen until the CEO's safety and identity could be independently verified. The policy protected not only the individual, but also the legal integrity of every major event taking place under the company's responsibility. Across corporate headquarters, encrypted notifications appeared simultaneously on executive devices. General Counsel, Chief Security Officer, President of Stadium Operations, Chair of the Board. Every message contained the same sentence. Executive Security Incident. CEO authentication confirmed. Immediate response required. At the same moment, the stadium's Executive Command Center received an automatic operational directive. Suspend executive access decisions. Freeze executive hospitality operations. Delay all major event activity pending executive clearance. No employee had authority to override the order except the CEO herself or the board chair. Meanwhile, inside Suite 401, nothing seemed to change. Ethan Collins folded his arms with growing confidence. "Finish calling your lawyer?" he asked with a smirk. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket. "No." She looked directly at him. "I called someone who can actually solve the problem." Ethan laughed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "This isn't a movie." Naomi answered quietly. "No, it's a leadership test." The words lingered in the air. Around the suite, uncertainty continued spreading. Emily Carter noticed several executives discreetly checking their phones. One frowned. Another suddenly stood up and walked toward the windows, speaking softly into a wireless headset. A third guest received a notification, glanced at the screen, then looked directly at Naomi before quickly hiding his expression. Something was changing. Nobody yet understood what. 2 floors below, the stadium's Executive Command Center erupted into controlled activity. Red authorization indicators appeared across multiple monitors. Executive security incident. Authentication verified. Operational hold required. The operations director stared at the display for several seconds before quietly saying, "Suspend the kickoff sequence." Engineers immediately contacted the broadcast control room. Security supervisors were redirected towards Suite 401. The stadium president, who had been greeting league officials on another level, abandoned the meeting the moment he received the encrypted alert. Within minutes, the chief legal officer, executive security director, and senior operations executives were all moving rapidly toward the private elevator serving the executive suites. Outside, television cameras continued showing excited fans who had no idea what was unfolding behind closed doors. Then, less than 7 minutes after Naomi's phone call, the countdown clock stopped. Music faded unexpectedly. The public address announcer received a single instruction through his headset. Delay kickoff until further notice. Inside Suite 401, Ethan Collins remained completely unaware that every decision he had made during the past 20 minutes had already triggered the most serious executive response protocol in the company's history. Naomi simply looked through the glass toward the brightly lit field below, listening to the distant cheers echo across the stadium. Somewhere beyond those walls, elevators were rising, executives were running, and the truth was coming towards Suite 401 one floor at a time. The announcement echoed across the stadium before anyone inside Suite 401 fully understood what had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an executive operational matter, today's kickoff has been temporarily delayed. We appreciate your patience." Confused murmurs spread through the luxury suite. Guests instinctively looked toward the field, then back toward one another. Ethan Collins frowned as his phone vibrated relentlessly in his pocket. 1 missed call became 5. 5 became 12. The names flashing across his screen made his stomach tighten. Stadium President, Chief Legal Officer, Executive Security, Board Chairman. He answered none of them. "What's going on?" One sponsor whispered. "Games aren't delayed over VIP disputes." Another executive quietly replied, "Then this isn't about a VIP dispute." Before another word could be spoken, the private elevator doors opened. The stadium president stepped out first, followed by the chief legal officer, the executive security director, and several senior executives moving with unmistakable urgency. Their eyes swept across the room for only a moment before settling on Naomi Brooks. Without hesitation, the stadium president walked directly toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away and lowered his head slightly. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice carrying through the silent suite. "I sincerely apologize for what you've experienced today. We came as quickly as protocol allowed." Every conversation disappeared. Ethan stared in disbelief as the most senior leaders in the building completely ignored him. The president then slowly turned to face everyone in the suite. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "I need everyone's attention." I followed him. "Allow me to introduce the woman many of you have spent the last 20 minutes questioning." He paused just long enough for the silence to deepen. "This is Naomi Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Capital Holdings, the parent company that owns this stadium, this hospitality division, and every executive operation conducted inside this facility." The words landed with crushing finality. No one moved. The businessman who had joked about a fake credential lowered his head. The woman who had whispered about better access control covered her mouth in disbelief. Emily Carter closed her eyes for a brief second, relieved that the truth no longer depended on her voice alone. Even the two security officers instinctively straightened their posture, now standing beside Naomi rather than in front of her. Ethan's face drained of color. "No," he whispered. That's impossible." The chief legal officer stepped forward, her expression unwavering. "No, Mr. Collins. What was impossible was believing you could ignore verified credentials, dismiss your own staff, and publicly humiliate the chief executive officer without consequences." Ethan looked desperately toward Naomi, searching for some sign that this could still be undone. She simply met his eyes with the same quiet composure she had carried from the very beginning. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She didn't remind him of every insult he had spoken. After a long silence, she spoke only one sentence. Respect should never depend on recognition. No one challenged her. No one even attempted to speak. Ethan's phone rang once more. This time he looked at the screen before his hands slowly began to shake. The caller was the chairman of the board. Around him, the entire suite remained motionless, because everyone understood that the most powerful person in the room had never been the loudest voice. She had simply been the one who never needed to prove who she was. For several endless seconds, no one moved. The only sound inside Suite 401 came from Ethan Collins' phone vibrating uncontrollably in his trembling hand. The screen continued flashing with calls from executives he had spent years trying to impress. This time, he couldn't bring himself to answer. The stadium president slowly turned away from Naomi and faced Ethan. His expression was no longer one of confusion. It was one of absolute certainty. "Mr. Collins," he said firmly, "effective immediately, surrender your executive credential." Ethan stared blankly. "Sir, if you'll just give me a chance to explain." "Your opportunity to explain ended when you ignored verified credentials, disregarded your own staff, and publicly humiliated our chief executive officer." The words echoed through the suite like a final judgment. A member of the executive security team stepped forward. "Your access badge, please." Ethan looked around the room, searching desperately for someone willing to support him. No one did. The businessman who had laughed moments earlier quietly stepped backward. The woman who had whispered about better access control lowered her eyes, unable to meet Naomi's gaze. Even the security officers who had been instructed to remove Naomi now stood respectfully beside her instead. Slowly, Ethan unclipped the executive badge from his jacket and placed it into the waiting hand of the security officer. Before anyone spoke again, the electronic lock attached to his company tablet emitted a sharp tone. "Access revoked." The screen went black. Seconds later, his company email disappeared from his phone. Then his digital credentials. One by one, every privilege attached to his position vanished before the eyes of everyone in the room. No dramatic announcement was necessary. Technology quietly confirmed what authority had already decided. Around the suite, conversations remained frozen. Guests who had watched the confrontation unfold now realized they had witnessed something much larger than an argument over a VIP seat. They had watched assumptions defeat professionalism. Emily Carter stood motionless near the hospitality desk until the stadium president turned toward her. "Miss Carter." She immediately straightened. "Yes, sir. Thank you for following policy instead of pressure." She blinked in surprise. "I was only trying to do the right thing." Naomi smiled gently. "That's usually harder than people expect." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. not because she had been praised, but because someone in real power had recognized integrity instead of position. Meanwhile, outside the suite, word had already begun spreading through the stadium. Staff members hurried through hallways carrying updated instructions. Television producers delayed live broadcasts. Commentators speculated about an unprecedented executive matter affecting the event. Fans filled social media with questions after seeing the unexpected announcement that kickoff had been postponed. None of them yet knew the true reason. Inside Suite 401, the chief legal officer quietly approached Naomi. "Ms. Brooks, the operational review team is assembled. Your instructions?" Naomi looked through the enormous glass wall toward the thousands of fans still waiting patiently in their seats. She answered without hesitation. "Resume the game as soon as every employee understands one thing." The attorney nodded. "And that is?" Naomi's voice remained calm enough that everyone in the suite heard every word. "No guest should ever need a title, a fortune, or an introduction before they are treated with dignity." Silence followed. No one challenged the statement. No one could, because everyone standing in that room understood that the greatest delay of the afternoon had never been the football game. It had been the time it took for respect to arrive. The game resumed 12 minutes later, but the stadium no longer felt the same. The whistle finally blew, the crowd erupted, and the players charged onto the field beneath the bright lights. Yet inside Suite 401, everyone understood that the most important moment of the afternoon had taken place long before the opening kickoff. Ethan Collins was escorted from the suite through a private corridor without handcuffs, without raised voices, and without the public spectacle he had tried to create for Naomi Brooks. His executive badge had already been deactivated. His company accounts were being suspended. His authority had disappeared long before he reached the elevator doors. He walked away carrying nothing except the weight of his own decisions. Naomi remained by the glass for another quiet moment, watching the game finally begin. Around her, the guests who had avoided her eyes only minutes earlier now struggled to find the courage to speak. The businessman who had laughed first stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have spoken up." Naomi looked at him without anger. "Next time," she replied gently. "Don't wait to find out who someone is before deciding what's right." He lowered his head, knowing there was nothing else to say. Nearby, the woman who had whispered about better access control quietly slipped out of the suite without a word. The silence she left behind spoke louder than another apology ever could. Emily Carter stood near the hospitality desk, still holding the same tablet that had nearly changed everything much earlier. Naomi walked toward her at an unhurried pace. Emily immediately straightened. "Ms. Brooks, I'm sorry I couldn't stop it sooner." Naomi smiled warmly for the first time that day. "You don't owe me an apology." Emily looked surprised. Naomi continued, her voice calm enough that only the two of them could hear. "Never apologize for telling the truth. People remember titles for a while. They remember courage for a lifetime." Emily felt tears fill her eyes. She nodded quietly, understanding that those words would stay with her long after this day became another headline. Rachel Morgan's voice came through Naomi's phone moments later. "The operational review team is ready. Legal is preparing recommendations. Would you like us to issue a public statement?" Naomi looked once more across the suite, then through the glass toward thousands of fans enjoying the game below. "Yes," she answered. "Keep it simple. Tell people we're reviewing our procedures. The lesson isn't about me. It's about how we treat people before we know who they are." "Understood," Rachel replied before ending the call. Naomi picked up the folded game program she had set aside before everything began. As she walked toward the exit, the former player rose to his feet and applauded. Emily joined him, then another guest, and another. Within seconds, the entire suite stood in respectful applause. Naomi never slowed her pace. She never turned around to acknowledge the ovation. She had not come looking for recognition. She had come looking for the truth, and she had found it. Just before the elevator doors closed, she glanced back one final time. "A stadium isn't measured by the size of its crowd," she said. "It's measured by how it treats the person no one recognizes." The doors closed quietly. The cheers from the field continued to echo throughout the building. Years later, very few people would remember the final score of that game. But they would never forget the afternoon a black CEO was removed from a VIP suite. The kickoff of the biggest game of the season was delayed, and one calm woman reminded an entire stadium that dignity should never depend on recognition.